Today we're going to talk about Chapter 7 survey research. Those of you who have been on the social psychology website know that almost everything on that website are surveys, and of course that's social psychology, but I used it in my own dissertation as well. I had three surveys. Yes, I had three surveys. Um, and five independent variables, one dependent variable. So let's go ahead and get started. If I can remember how to do this. This is the second time I've started this actually. You start talking, you don't talk all day long. And then you start talking and all of a sudden, choke yourself up. Anyway, survey research is a quantitative and qualitative method with two important characteristics. First, the variables of interest are measured using self-reports. That's what a survey is. It's people telling you they're answering the questions that you're asking using questionnaires or interviews. In essence, survey researchers ask their participants, who are often called respondents in survey research, to report directly on their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Second, considerable attention is paid to the issue of sampling. In particular, survey researchers have a strong preference for large random samples because they provide the most accurate estimates of what is true in the population. In fact, survey research may be the only approach in psychology in which random sampling is routinely used. Now, we talk about random sampling all the time as far as the scientific method is concerned, but it's really difficult in psychology to use random sampling. But in survey, of course, you can. In surveys, beyond these two characteristics, almost anything goes in survey research. Surveys can be long or short. They can be conducted in person, by telephone, through the mail, or over the internet. They can be about voting intentions, consumer preferences, social attitudes, health, or anything else that is possible to ask people about and receive meaningful answers. Although survey data are often analyzed using statistics, there are many questions that lend themselves to more qualitative analysis. Most survey research is non-experimental. It is used to describe single variables and also to assess statistical relationships between variables. But surveys can also be used within experimental research. Lerner and colleagues used self-report measures and a large national sample identified their work as survey research. But their manipulation of an independent variable, anger versus fear, to assess its effects on a dependent variable, which was risk judgments, also identifies their work as experimental. And of course, there's the angry faces and there's the fearful faces. In 1948, the first national election survey by the Survey Research Center was conducted at the University of Michigan. This work eventually became the American National Election Studies as a collaboration of Stanford University and the University of Michigan, and these studies continue today. From market research and election polling, survey research made its way into several academic fields, including political science, sociology, and public health, where it continues to be one of the primary approaches to collecting new data. And this is the 1948 election. It was between Landon and Dewey. No, Dewey and Truman. I'm sorry, this is Harry Truman. Harry Truman won, and Dewey lost. But what happened was all the surveys were predicting that Dewey would win. So this is a Chicago Daily Tribune. It actually printed copies of a newspaper that said that Dewey defeated Truman, but which wasn't true at all, of course. Truman was the president from 45 through 52. He took over after Franklin Roosevelt died in office, and he just ran the one term. He completed Roosevelt's fifth term, and then he won an election in 48. And then in 52, Eisenhower won. Not that that's important. It is, I guess, if you're a history buff. Beginning in the 1930s, psychologists made important advances in questionnaire design, including techniques that are still used today, such as the Likert scale, developed by Rensis Likert. And there's Mr. Likert right there, Mr. Pruneface Likert. Survey research has a strong historical association with the social psychological study of attitudes, stereotypes, and prejudice. Early attitude researchers were also among the first psychologists to seek larger and more diverse samples than the convenience samples of university students that were routinely used in psychology. And of course, they still are because they're cheaper. You can survey college students for free. That's the way it works. The heart of any survey research project is the survey itself. Although it is easy to think of interesting questions to ask people, constructing a good survey is not easy at all. And I can tell you it's not easy at all. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of psychology researchers use other people's surveys, ones that have already been standardized, ones that they know work, ones that have been accepted in the field as this actually measures depression, this actually measures anxiety, this actually measures resilience, whatever it is that you're measuring. The problem is that the answers people give can be influenced in unintended ways by the wording of the items, the order of the items, the response options provided, and many other factors. At best, these influences add noise to the data. At worst, they result in systematic biases and misleading results. And we see this all the time. Sometimes people mean to skew the results on a survey, and we see this with political surveys that one side, if it's one run by the Republicans, and the Republicans will skew it so that you can only answer things the way they want you to, and the Democrats, of course, do exactly the same thing. So when you're looking at surveys from one political party or the other, a lot of times what you're dealing with is skewed results that you can't trust. So don't listen. This figure presents a model of the cognitive processes that people engage in when responding to a survey item. This is question interpretation, information retrieval, judgment formation, response formatting, and response editing. Respondents must interpret the question, retrieve the relevant information from memory, form a tentative judgment, convert the tentative judgment into one of the response options provided, rating on a 1 to 7 scale, and finally edit their response as necessary. This is the, we're looking at this survey question right here. How many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical day? And one answer is a lot more than average, somewhat more than average, average, somewhat fewer than average, a lot fewer than average. This item poses several difficulties for the respondents. First, they must interpret the question. How many alcoholic drinks do you consume in a typical day? They must decide whether alcoholic drinks include beer and wine as opposed to just hard liquor, and whether a typical day is a typical weekday, typical weekend day, or both. Once respondents have interpreted the question, they must retrieve relevant information from memory to answer it. But what information should they retrieve, and how should they go about retrieving it? They might think vaguely about some recent occasions on which they drank alcohol. They might carefully try to recall and count the number of alcoholic drinks they consumed last week. Or they might retrieve some existing beliefs that they have about themselves. For example, I am not much of a drinker. Then they must use this information to arrive at a tentative judgment about how many alcoholic drinks they consume in a typical day. This This might mean dividing the number of alcoholic drinks they consumed last week by 7 to come up with an average number per day. They must format this tentative answer in terms of the response options actually provided. Then there are additional problems of interpretation. What does average mean, and what would count as somewhat more than average? They must decide whether they want to report the response that they have come up with or whether they want to edit it in some way. If they believe that they drink a lot more than average, they might not want to report that for fear of looking bad in the eyes of the researcher, so instead they may opt to select the somewhat more than average response option. There are many things that can affect or guide, and yeah, this is, you're trying to figure out what they want, and of course, if they don't tell you what average is, then you might think average is, hey, dude, that's a case, isn't it? Or that's a 6 pack, or that's a 12 pack, or that's an 18 pack. I watch people. I eat lunch at a gas station. They've got a restaurant attached to it. And I watch the people buying beer all the time. They stop by and buy an 18 pack or a 12 pack. Usually it's an 18 pack. Anyway, so what is average? If you drink all those beers in one day, is that average? Maybe it's average for you. Yeah, so they really need to define what they're talking about here. There are many things that can affect or guide a subject to answer a survey question with ideas other than their own. These are known as context effects. Poor question construction can be a context effect. There is an item order effect when the order in which the items are presented affects people's responses. One item can change how participants interpret a later item or change the information that they retrieve to respond to later items. People tend to assume that middle response options represent what is normal or typical. So if they think of themselves as normal or typical, they tend to choose middle response options. To mitigate against order effects, rotate questions and response items when there is no natural order. Counterbalancing or randomizing the order of presentation of the questions in online surveys are good practices for survey questions and can reduce response order effects. Questionnaire items can be either open-ended or closed-ended. Open-ended items simply ask a question and allow participants to answer in whatever way they choose. Open-ended items are useful when researchers do not know how participants might respond or when they want to avoid influencing their responses. Open-ended items are more qualitative in nature. Open-ended items are relatively easy to write because there are no response options to worry about. They take more time and effort on the part of the participants, and they are more difficult for the researcher to analyze because the answers must be transcribed, coded, and submitted to some form of qualitative analysis, such as content analysis. Another disadvantage is that respondents are more likely to skip open-ended items because they take longer to answer. Closed-ended items ask a question about and provide a set of response options for participants to choose from. Closed-ended items are used when researchers have a good idea of the different responses that participants might make. They're more quantitative in nature, so they are also used when researchers are interested in a well-defined variable or construct such as participants' level of agreement with some statement, perceptions of risk, or frequency of a particular behavior. Closed-ended items are more difficult to write because they must include an appropriate set of response options. They are relatively quick and easy for participants to complete. They are also much easier for researchers to analyze because the responses can be easily converted to numbers and entered onto a spreadsheet. Of these reasons, closed-ended items are much more common. I'm sorry, for these reasons, closed-ended items are much more common. All closed-ended items include a set of response options from which a participant must choose. For categorical variables like sex, race, or political party preference, the categories are usually listed and participants choose the one or the ones to which they belong. These are Democrats, this is the Green Party, this is the Constitution Party, these are Republicans, this is the Libertarian Party, and this is the new Whig Party. I'd never even heard of these guys. I guess they started in 2018, so we'll see if we ever see the eagle again. I'm sorry, that's the owl again. It's the thinking party, the Whigs. For quantitative variables, a rating scale is typically provided. A rating scale is an ordered set of responses that participants must choose from. The number of response options on a typical rating scale ranges from 3 to 11, although 5 and 7 are probably most common. I had an argument one time. This is crazy. Psychologists will argue about anything. We were talking about Likert scales. And of course, the original Likert scale had 5 options. And this guy said that if you didn't have 5 options, like the original Likert scale, you had to call it a Likert-like scale. So 3 was a Likert-like scale, and 7 options was a Likert-like scale. Now, normally it's an odd number, as weird as that sounds. So it's 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 are usually what you have. But the original Likert scale was actually never, rarely, sometimes, often, and always. 5-point scales are best for unipolar scales, where only one construct is tested, such as frequency. 7-point scales are best for bipolar scales, where there is a dichotomous spectrum, such as liking, like very much, like somewhat, like slightly, neither like nor dislike, dislike slightly, dislike somewhat, dislike very much. A rough guideline for writing questionnaire items is provided by the Brusso model, and this was developed by Peterson in 2000. An acronym, Brusso, stands for brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. Effective questionnaire items are brief and to the point. They avoid long, overly technical, or unnecessary words. This brevity makes them easier for respondents to understand and faster for them to complete. Effective questionnaire items are also relevant to the research question. If a respondent's sexual orientation, marital status, or income is not relevant, then items on them should probably not be included. Again, this makes the questionnaire faster to complete, but it also avoids annoying respondents with what they will rightly perceive as irrelevant or even nosy questions. Effective questionnaire items are also unambiguous. They can be interpreted in only one way. Part of the problem with the alcohol item presented earlier is that different respondents might have different ideas about what constitutes an alcoholic drink or a typical day. Effective questionnaire items are also specific so that it is clear to respondents what their response should be about and clear to researchers what it is about. A common problem here is close-ended items that are double-barreled. They ask about 2 conceptually separate items, but allow only one response. For example, please rate the extent to which you have been feeling anxious and depressed. This item should probably be split into 2 separate items, one about anxiety and one about depression, or one about a dog, a basset hound. Effective questionnaire items are objective in the sense that they do not reveal the researcher's own opinions or lead participants to answer in a particular way. The best way to know how people interpret the wording of the question is to conduct a pilot test and ask a few people to explain how they interpreted the question. It is important to create an appropriate response scale. For categorical variables, the categories presented should generally be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Mutually exclusive categories do not overlap. For a religion item, for example, the categories of Christian and Catholic are not mutually exclusive, but Protestant and Catholic are mutually exclusive. Catholic is a Christian religion, so asking somebody if they're Christian or Catholic doesn't make any sense. Exhaustive categories cover all possible responses. Although Protestant and Catholic are mutually exclusive, they are not exhaustive because there are many other religious categories that a respondent might select: Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and so on. In many cases, it is not feasible to include every possible category, in which case an other category with a space for the respondent to fill in a more specific response is a good solution. If respondents could belong to more than one category, for example, race, they should be instructed to choose all categories that apply. Writing effective items is only one part of the constructing a survey. Every survey should have a written or spoken introduction that serves two basic functions. One is to encourage respondents to participate in the survey. The introduction should briefly explain the purpose of the survey and its importance, provide information about the sponsor of the survey. University-based surveys tend to generate higher response rates. Acknowledge the importance of the respondents' participation, and describe any incentives for participating. There's a problem with this picture, and I put it in here anyway. The problem is that they're shaking with their left hand. People don't do that. As a matter of fact, if she's really Muslim, it looks like she might be, then shaking with your left hand is an insult. This is really kind of a curious picture. A second function of the introduction is to establish informed consent. Remember that this involves describing to respondents everything that might affect their decision to participate. This includes the topics covered by the survey, the amount of time it is likely to take, the respondent's option to withdraw at any time, confidentiality issues, and so on. Written consent forms are not always used in survey research when the research is of minimal risk, and completion of the survey instrument is often accepted by the IRB as evidence of consent to participate, so it is important that this part of the introduction be well documented and presented clearly and in its entirety to every respondent. It is important to present clear instructions for completing the questionnaire, including examples of how to use any unusual response scales. Remember that the introduction is the point at which respondents are usually most interested and least fatigued. So it is a good practice to start with the most important items for purposes of the research and proceed to less important items. Demographic items are often presented last because they are least interesting to the participants, but also easy to answer in the event respondents have become tired or bored. Of course, any survey should end with an expression of appreciation to the respondents. Essentially, all psychological research involves sampling, selecting a sample to study from the population of interests. Sampling falls into two broad categories: probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling occurs when the researcher can specify the probability that each member of the population will be selected for this sample. Non-probability sampling occurs when the researcher cannot specify these probabilities. Most psychological research involves non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling, studying individuals who happen to be nearby and willing to participate, is a very common form of non-probability sampling used in psychological research. And this is what we see with college students. They're a convenience sample. Snowball sampling, in which existing research participants help recruit additional participants for the study. Quota sampling, in which subgroups in the sample are recruited to be proportional to those subgroups in the population. Self-select sampling, in which individuals choose to take part in the research on their own accord without being approached by the researcher directly. And so when we see a survey in a magazine, let's say we see a survey in a magazine, and it really doesn't matter which magazine. Now that's a self-selection sample, because if they do fill out the survey, they are the ones who bought the magazine, and so they're interested in whatever the topic is. And only select individuals will fill out surveys anyway. So this is a whole self-selection sampling. So you really couldn't make any generalizations from this type of sampling. Survey researchers are much more likely to use some form of probability sampling. This tendency is because the goal of most survey research is to make accurate estimates about what is true in a particular population. And these estimates are most accurate when based on a probability sample. Probability sampling requires a very clear specification of the population, which depends on the research question to be answered. Once the population has been specified, the probability sampling requires a sampling frame. This sampling frame is essentially a list of all the members of the population from which to select the respondents. Sampling frames can come from a variety of sources, including telephone directories, lists of registered voters, and hospital or insurance records. Simple random sampling is done in such a way that each individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected for the sample. This type of sampling could involve putting the names of all individuals in the sampling frame into a hat, mixing them up, and then drawing out the number needed for the sample. Sorry, I needed a drink. Given that most sampling frames take the form of computer files, random sampling is more likely to involve computerized sorting or selection of respondents. A common approach in telephone surveys is random digit dialing, in which a computer randomly generates phone numbers from among possible phone numbers within a given geographic area. A common alternative to simple random sampling is stratified random sampling, in which the population is divided into different subgroups or strata, usually based on demographic characteristics, and then a random sample is taken from each stratum. Proportionate stratified random sampling can be used to select a sample in which the proportion of respondents in each of various subgroups matches the proportion in the population. For example, because about 12.6% of the American population is African American, stratified random sampling can be used to ensure that a survey of 1,000 American adults includes about 126 African American respondents. Disproportionate stratified random sampling can also be used to sample extra respondents from particularly small subgroups, allowing valid conclusions to be drawn about those subgroups. For example, because Asian Americans make up a relatively small percentage of the American population, about 5.6%, a simple random sample of 1,000 American adults might include too few Asian Americans to draw any conclusions about them, as distinct from any other subgroup. If representation is important to the research question, then disproportionate stratified random sampling could be used to ensure that enough Asian American respondents are included in the sample to draw valid conclusions about Asian Americans as a whole. Cluster sampling, where the larger clusters of individuals are randomly sampled and then individuals within each cluster are randomly sampled. This is the only probability sampling method that does not require a sampling frame. Sampling bias occurs when a sample is selected in such a way that it is not representative of the entire population and therefore produces inaccurate results. If survey non-responders differ from survey responders in a systematic way, then this difference can produce non-response bias. The four main ways to conduct surveys are through in-person interviews, by telephone, through the mail, and over the internet. As with other aspects of survey design, the choice depends on both the researcher's goals and the budget. In-person interviews have the highest response rates and provide the closest personal contact with respondents. Personal contact can be important, but in-person interviewing is by far the most costly approach. Telephone surveys have lower response rates and still provide some personal contact with respondents. Mail surveys are less costly still, but generally have even lower response rates, making them most susceptible to non-response bias. And that is the end of the chapter. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to do this week with the discussion questions is that we're going to create our own survey. And a couple of years ago, when I taught this class, I decided, well, why not? Why not? Let's find out just how much people know about the Dene people. So let's write a survey for non-natives and find out what their knowledge base is about the Navajo people, the Navajo Nation. So that's what we're going to do. I have some notes on it somewhere here in my stack of papers. So that's what your research question, or that's what your discussion question is going to be. You have to come up with a couple of research questions. They can be open-ended, they can be closed-ended, but you need to remember that their knowledge base is not very extensive. Well, anyway, we'll get into that when you do the discussion. So, okay, next week we're going to tackle 2 chapters, 8 and 9. I guess I could find out what they actually are. Chapter 8 and 9, dependent variable, that's not right. Quasi-experimental research and factorial designs. Okay, next week. Can't wait.